So my name is Richard Fennell, and I'm a global training specialist at Luxion, makers of KeyShot. And today we're going to be talking about workflow going from KeyShot into Photoshop. So the goal of this tutorial isn't necessarily to show you everything that can be done in Photoshop. What we want to do is we want to focus on some of the tools that are built into KeyShot to kind of optimize that workflow. What we'll do is we'll break down a scene, and then we'll talk about all the different kinds of output that we have. I can give you a run through here. So we'll talk about render layers, different render passes, excuse me, including like the clown pass and the depth pass, what they are, how we use them, and then some kind of extra passes as well. So we'll start layering everything together in Photoshop. And just for reference, this is the model that's being used in today's webinar. We'll also include this presentation as a PDF after the fact as well, so you can have some of these images as reference, because that will be good to have. So how do we take everything into Photoshop? Okay, so there are going to be a couple of things that we're going to talk about, and I'll come back and refer to some of these. But render layers, for example, render layers are going to be a pro feature. So some of the render layers and render passes are pro features. But if you don't know you've got these, you can start assigning pieces of geometry to layers and then actually get those as output so that when you render it, you don't have to do as much selection or masking. So we'll talk about render layers. Freebies you also get included with your render passes. I wouldn't say freebies, but they don't add on much time to the rendering, are things like clown passes and depth passes. So in order to be able to make easier selections, we can use a clown pass. Depth pass will allow us to use some interesting post-processing techniques for techniques like depth of field or fog, and we'll run through some of those. So those you get as kind of add-ons with the Pro features. There are going to be some other things that we're going to talk about as well. So for example, if you don't have Pro, how do you get some of that functionality of the clown pass? So we'll talk about doing things like masking passes and other techniques. Some other techniques that aren't reliant on Pro include things like a shadow pass or an ambient occlusion pass. These are going to be kind of post-processing techniques that we can use to kind of boost our shadows or to create more depth in our images. And then here you can see we've also got some other ones like ground shadow passes and layer mask passes. So using flat materials, for example, with a layer mask in order to create masks that you can use in Photoshop, and especially with some of these like difficult to work with selections coming from things like depth of field or motion blur as well. So all right, so let's go ahead and hop into KeyShot. Let's take a look at the scene that we're going to be working with. In this case, again, this is a model that I got from TurboSquid. Luxion partners with TurboSquid, so I was able to download this and take a look at it. Oops, got some real quick. Sounds okay. All right, awesome. Someone had raised the hand, so I was just double checking on that. So this scene here has been basically all prepped and ready to go. And what we've actually done in order to cut down on the time, we've already done all the renderings that we're going to be working with today. So what I want to do is, first of all, give you kind of a rundown on the scene and what it is, and we'll do some setup in order to go to Photoshop and start working there. So first of all, you can see here that I've got a bunch of different objects. They're all broken out. I actually use the geometry editor in order to break out different pieces of geometry, select faces, do some additions and kind of cleaning up that were necessary just for this particular scene. I've got a camera that's I actually am on the free camera right now, so I didn't lock it. But if I zoom in, you'll see that this is a pretty well detailed model. So things like the threads on the screw here were made with textures, not necessarily modeled geometry. But we've got some of those details in there. Things like the graphics here, those were included with the TurboSquid geometry. So I broke those out as separate layers in Photoshop so that I could then assign materials to those labels. So things like these graphics here are actually a plastic material on top of my kind of metallic finish. I don't want to get into the setup too much, but so some of that was done to help boost the realism. In this case, the texture was applied as a roughness texture on that brush finish. Some other kind of notable materials. For example, here, these parts, we're going to make these glow later in Photoshop. We're not going to have the best luck trying to get that glow in one shot in KeyShot. So what we've done on these two little parts, because these are going to be visible in our final scene, if I double click on these, you'll notice that they're the emissive material. So this is the really simple light emitting material, and I generally don't tend to use this very often. The reason I'm using it in this case is because we can apply a color texture to it. So the result here is trying to get kind of a subtle fade on the inside of that light emitting material. In that case, I used a color gradient. On this upright part, we used a diamond gradient. On this part right here, this is the same emissive material. Well, it's an unlinked emissive material, and then it has a cylindrical color gradient on it because we want kind of the intensity to fade from the inside out, so lighter in the middle going to more saturated on the outside. So those are two kind of interesting parts that I was planning. We'll actually add a little bit of glow on those parts in Photoshop. But from a material prep standpoint, wanted to give you a little bit of heads up on how that's going to look. Excuse me. Another thing that was customized in here was the ground plane. So if I double click, you'll notice that, or actually if I show you in the scene tree here, we've added a ground plane, and that's going up to edit, add geometry, and adding a ground plane. I use this to get a lot more control over my ground, because if I double click on it, you can see we have a ground material, and I can define the specularity, for example, how reflective that ground plane is. And so what I did is I added a little bit of roughness to it. So instead of it being super sharp, then it's also going to give a little bit of a softer reflection there. But yeah, let me just double check here. All right, cool, we're good. All right, we've got some of our staff on site here, so that's good. Josh, if you can hear me, and if you wouldn't mind keeping an eye on the questions, let me know if anything comes up. But yeah, so that's some of our scene kind of build up here. So what we'll actually do is we'll render this on a dark gray background color. So we're not going to use a backplate, and definitely not the lighting environment. We're just going to render this onto a dark gray. And through Photoshop, we'll be able to drop that onto whatever color we do want. You'll also notice that my lighting environment is pretty busy. Got a lot going on there, and that lighting environment is actually tied to this camera 1. So camera 1 I set up as this angle that I specifically wanted, some angle, some distance, no depth of field. And then I started building a lighting environment to match it. So that's using the HDRI editor here. So if I click on that, you'll see that I'll have this nice complex light setup, right? So we've got all these individual pins, and some are different shapes. Some are actually set as negative brightness to call out specific highlights on my model in certain key areas. This dark pin, for example, here, that's set to a negative brightness. And that's actually fading this back portion out. While we were preparing the scene, some of the feedback that I got was that that was too bright, so we used that in order to actually back that out. So yeah, that's a really quick run through of the scene setup here. I don't want to focus on it too much. We can come back to it in the Q&A, but I don't want to focus on it too much just because there is a lot of detail in there. But suffice to say, definitely a custom environment in order to get the best results. And then our lighting tab. So if I take a look at the settings, this is actually pretty low quality settings. I just use the product setting, and then I just back down some of those settings. Like ray bounces, I could get away with fewer ray bounces because I didn't really have a lot of reflective or transparent layers. I also disabled ground illumination, global illumination, because in this case it's not necessary in this. It's just going to add on a little bit to our render time. Anybody who listened in last month for the render settings, right? In this case, global illumination is not going to give us too much. I actually want this to be nice and dark under there. I think I also bumped up the shadow quality to something like 3, just because I wanted those to have a little bit more calculation in them. So yeah, that's kind of what the setup looked like. And if you'll notice here, the scene is actually pretty good as far as kind of the lighting and materials goes. I have some kind of soft highlights on my parts, whether they're on the more reflective materials or materials that have kind of a bump texture or roughness to them. One thing I want to clarify is I don't use Photoshop to kind of make adjustments to materials or reflections or things like that. That's the kind of stuff I do want to get in KeyShot to start with. Because then if I change the camera in KeyShot or zoom in or zoom out, then that means I don't have to Photoshop that detail in again. So if you're not necessarily happy with the materials that you're getting in KeyShot, then I wouldn't use Photoshop in order to fix that kind of stuff. You want to get your materials in KeyShot. We've got lots and lots of great tutorials, webinars, quick tips, and blog posts about how to adjust your materials and lighting. So yeah, I'll take a quick glance over at the questions, and if there's nothing too big, yeah, perfect. Sorry? Okay, awesome. All right, no sweat. Well then, cool. Then I'll just keep an eye. Just let me know if anything comes up, Josh. But yeah, perfect. Okay, so let's talk about actual output here. So let's go down and we'll do what we call our offline render. We'll actually render out some images. Or we'll go through the process of rendering those out. We'll talk about what we did. I actually already rendered those. So we have some different options as far as our output. So first what I did is I just rendered all these to straight Photoshop files. Most of the time I'm going to be rendering out PNGs, but since this was going to be focusing primarily on Photoshop, then why not just output the native files that we're going to be working with? Especially when we get into render passes and render layers, I have the option to add all of those to the Photoshop file. So the result that I get is one big fat Photoshop file with all our layers in it, which is pretty nice. So let's get into first of all, render layers. So what the heck are render layers? I'm going to go ahead and check this checkbox. It's a pro feature, but if you have KeyShot Pro and you're not using it, then this is going to be really helpful. Well, I'll go ahead and check it, and I still have to go back into my scene tree and make some adjustments. Okay, so what render layers do is they allow us to assign, and I'll go back here to bring up this kind of reference image, we can assign any piece of geometry to a separate render layer. That means when we hit render, we're going to get our composite image, our full image over here shown on the left hand side, and we can start breaking out geometry onto separate layers so that when you go into Photoshop, you don't need to mask or do any selections. So let's go ahead and set up some render layers. All right, I think I'll try to replicate what I had done in the output Photoshop file. The first and probably one of the coolest, most important, neatest ones is if you've added a ground plane, this ground plane is now a piece of geometry. That means I can just select, for example, the ground plane here, and I can add it to a render layer. So in order to add it to a render layer, just expand the render layer drop down, and then I hit this little icon here, and I now have a render layer. So render layer 1, if I right click, I can rename that, and I'll call it ground. One of the questions I get pretty often is how do I actually get more control over my reflections or my shadows? Well, if we actually assign that to its own render layer, well then we're good. We can just take that into Photoshop, and now it's isolated to its own layer. We can make adjustments. Make adjustments there. Talking too fast. All right, so let's assign some other render layers. That's probably my biggest, the ground. I'll also select my lights because these have an emissive material on it, and because they're emissive, they're not really they're not super bright, and since I actually don't have global illumination turned on, they're really not going to be having much effect. That's okay. All I really want to do is add a little kind of a subtle glow to those, and for that I'd definitely use I'd use some Photoshop. So what I'll do is I'll select my light. So for example here, I'll select that one, add a new render layer, and then if I right click and rename it, I can call that lights, because I can select my other piece of geometry that's going to be glowing and then click lights for it. So now for those two parts, they're going to go on their own render layer and work to make them glow in Photoshop, because they're doing everything they need to do right here. We'll just add a little bit of glow there. So it's really just a matter of isolating the pieces of geometry you want and then assigning it to render layers. So this tone arm here, I'll just add that to a new render layer, and I'll call it tone arm. And I think I'd also had one for my turntable here. Same deal. new render layer, rename it. And I think the last bit that I had here was this, the actual kind of base, our main body of this, this turntable. So I'll just select, here we'll select top panel, turntable, and I think we're good there. Oh, bottom panel. All right, so even if I have multiple parts selected, I can then go in, I can make a new render layer, rename this one, and call it base. So as you can see here, I have 5 new render layers. That means when I render this out, I get 5 additional images. No more masking, no more erasing using the magic wand tool, all that kind of stuff. So those are my render layers, and they're set and they're good to go. For this one, we're also going to enable a depth pass and a clown pass. So what are these two? You may have been pleasantly surprised if you've tried using these before and just discovered the clown pass, because it's pretty neat. What it will do is it will create another image that's output, and that image is all flat colors for every individual material. So each material, as you can see here, that's a different material gets a different color. That makes, if we want to use a magic wand tool, that makes that selection really, really easy. Instead of making a bunch of render layers, you can also just work with the clown pass in order to get some kind of easy selections. The depth pass we'll get into in detail in a little bit, but that's also one that we can output that allows us to do some kind of creative post-processing as well. So if I go back here, enable depth pass, clown pass, and my render layers, we'll render this out. So I've already rendered it, but that's how that image was rendered. Geometric normal passes, so this will allow you to render a normal pass based off of your KeyShot output. I'll show you what that looks like, but I don't tend to use this at all kind of in my Photoshop composition process. This is going to be most helpful if you are trying to create a normal map from your KeyShot geometry. So let's say you modeled a complex pattern once and then wanted to make a texture out of it. That's the pass that we would use for it. We're not going to be covering that today. Hopefully in the future we can have a webinar that's mostly focused on textures. So I'll deselect that for now. I'll show you what it looks like, and then I think most everybody's going to shrug and be like, oh, okay, yeah, I'll never use that. And that's okay. That's probably going to be more useful for some workflows outside of Photoshop. But yeah, so what I did for this image is I set it as PSD, check these checkboxes, make sure I had add to PSD to actually add everything to a Photoshop file. In this case, I rendered it really high res, so about almost 8K. Because then that way I just have a lot to work with. I definitely don't render this high every day, but I wanted to have a lot of detail. And then I just set this for maximum samples. And most of these examples that I'm showing you here were rendered anywhere between like 64 and 128 samples, and I'll try to call out the ones that needed higher samples. So that's it for kind of the KeyShot setup, at least for now. So I'll hit Shift P or pause my real-time view, and we can pretend like we waited here the 15 or 20 minutes these images took to render. Not all of them, obviously, but this first one, for example, let's talk about our beauty shot. So that's what I rendered this out as. Okay, so when this file opens up, you can see that I have a bunch of layers here under my layers, right? So a couple of our notable ones. First, I'll try to, disclaimer, I am not like a total Photoshop guru. The goal here is to show you some neat tricks when bringing your stuff into Photoshop. There are tons and tons of resources for great Photoshop tutorials. So anybody who really knows layer masks or some of these things, you'll probably be yelling shortcuts at me that I can't hear. But yeah, I will definitely show you what I know. But yeah, so for example, if you just want to show one layer with your list of layers, you can always hold down the Alt key and click on the little eyeball next to that layer. So you can see here what that does is it isolates just that layer. So here's our clown pass. And if I zoom in a little bit there, Control plus and minus, then you can see that every different material got its own flat color. That means whenever I use the magic wand tool, we can make some really easy, easy and quick selections based off of color. So that's where that clown pass is perfect. I promised you I'd show you a normal pass. This is what the normal pass looks like. So it's going to define reflections of surfaces based off of red, green, and blue values. And that's how more advanced textures are used. In this case, we're not going to be able to get much use out of it in our Photoshop workflow. So we'll uncheck that one and probably not look at it again. Our RGB layer, so this is our composite layer. This is what you're normally used to seeing as like your final rendering. So this is a flat image. This one doesn't have any transparency. We'll come back and talk about transparency. But so this is the flat image, our kind of final composite. These are all our render layers, and this is where it gets really cool. If you'll notice, all of these, whatever I selected as a render layer, comes out as a separate Photoshop layer. So our lights, our ground plane, right? All of this stuff are, or all of these pieces of geometry are now just a Photoshop layer. Where this is really cool is if I want to make just some adjustment to some part. Let's say I want to do a couple quick color variations of, for example, the base here. Well, then I could select that layer. So this layer is just the base. And if I go in and let's say we make an adjustment to it. Not going to do anything that sticks, but just to show it, let's colorize it and let's change the hue and saturation. Right, so this is not beautiful right now, right? But I just want to show that you can isolate that geometry to a layer, and you should be able to do all sorts of changes to whatever those layers are. So render layers, awesome for isolating that. Another pretty common thing I do here is with a light. So if I zoom in on our lights, which I rendered as a separate render layer, you can see that if I just enable the lights, that's what my lights look like. Okay, so those are just my lights right there. And let's zoom way in. I'm going to see if I can isolate a problem that I see every once in a while. So there are my lights, and if I zoom way in, you'll notice, or actually let's go in and let's throw in a quick fill layer. We're just going to put this onto let's say a white layer and put it behind our lights. And this is the problem that I was trying to isolate. And some of you may have seen this before. Sometimes when you work with render layers or transparency, you get these kind of ghosted outlines. So that has to do with how transparency is resolved. And so in this case, we have kind of a blending of visible pixels to transparency, and I'm getting those kind of lines. If this was pure white, you'd see like a black outline, and that can be really annoying because then you have to go in and brush it out. There's actually a tool built into Photoshop for fixing exactly that. If I go up to layer and then matting, there's an option for defringe. So if I have the lights layer selected, go layer, matting, defringe. Well, defringing will remove some amount of pixels. I'm gonna say 1 pixel. Now when I hit OK, I get rid of that little dark outline. Just learning that not too long ago has now saved me hours and hours of Photoshop work. So that's a good little tip in there. So now I don't have that layer around, or that little border around this layer, right? And if I put it on top of my base layer, then that's going to look okay. Whenever you're working with render layers, I do always suggest having the full composite image underneath so that this can just go right on top and we don't have to worry about any of that pixel overlap. All right, so if we want to make these lights glow a little bit, we've isolated them to a layer, so that's going to be the really easy way to do it. So now what I can do is I can rely on my blending options. So I can select my layer that has the lights on it, then go up to blending options, and this allows us to make selective modifications to a single layer. The one I want to use here will be outer glow, because as you should be able to see, now I have a little bit of glow around that layer. It's a really, really simple kind of adjustment. Now you can see I can control the opacity of that, and I can make sure that the color of the glow actually matches kind of my blue in those LEDs or whatever the light is in there. But now I can really quickly just add a little bit of glowing around those objects, right? So this is completely subjective, just depends on how you want to take it. But this is one of the easiest ways to add kind of a glow to your light. So here's with no glow, there's with a little glow, just kind of softens that up. And now I get the impression that those lights are on. So really easy, but yeah, just isolating that to a layer and then using blending options in order to make that work. If you are gonna render an image and you do render layers and depth pass and cloud pass, the addition to your render time is basically negligible. And that's already calculated when you do the rendering. You'll notice also the rendered layers all it does is mask stuff out for you. So it's really just KeyShot's clipping that for you and then putting it as a layer. So no, these are the depth pass. I don't always do, but clown pass I almost always output and then render layers. If you assign those in advance, that just saves you some time in post-processing. Cool. All right, so let's talk about transparency a little bit, because if those of you who are working with anti-aliasing issues or things like that, this is something you may have run into. In KeyShot, whenever you do a rendering, and let's say I go in and I hit the render button and I enable transparency. If you include transparency, what this does, even if you have the ground plane, the special added ground plane, or if I turn it off, anything that's a background color, in this case dark gray, but if I change that to something like a bright blue, right? Anything that's shadows here, it has to have some sort of color information. So when you're working with transparency, whatever the shadow is or whatever color the reflections are will be blended into that, even though I say render with transparency. So if I rendered this out on a blue background, which I did here, let's open that up. Oh, don't show it just now, right? But take a look at this. So here's my object that I rendered with transparency, and you'll notice because in KeyShot I rendered this on a blue background, that means my shadows and my reflections are tinted blue. So on blue, that looks great. If I change that to white, that looks weird, right? So whenever you're working with transparency, plan for your background colors. Or what you could also do, which we'll get into here, is you can render your ground plane to a separate layer. Right? So what's really cool about that is I now have my shadows and my reflections set to a separate piece of geometry. So if I wanted my object here to be on a white background, I didn't render it that way, but we can do that. What I could do is, let's say I get my my background layer, and in this case, just so I don't mess with it too much, I'm going to duplicate it by hitting Control J, and then let's mask out everything except for the turntable, our object. Well, this is where the clown pass comes in really handy. I just select the clown pass, and then I can go to my magic wand tool, and I will select everything kind of an empty space. So it's just the yellow. I had that ground plane added, so now it's just selecting yellow. And what I'll do here is I'll go up to select, and I'll inverse it. So I'm just selecting what I want to see. Now what I can do is, if I select my target layer, the one I actually want to do the masking on, if I hit this little icon right here for add layer mask, it'll use my selection in order to define that layer mask. So I've essentially masked out everything else. So now I've got my object. And here I have my ground plane. So there are my ground shadows on my object. Now I'll just go up to layer. We will make a new fill layer. Let's put this on a solid color, right? And then if I set that to white and put it behind my ground plane, right, now my shadows blend onto my background. What's cool about this is, since my shadows are on that layer, I can set the blending mode of that layer to something like multiply. So now, regardless of my background color, let's say I wanted it red or blue, right? I can get that to blend onto my background color, which is pretty cool. So I don't tend to work with much transparency in my output because the render layers and output give me so much control there. Right, so that's something, again, Clown Pass used to create those selections, and then isolating those ground shadows is going to be really, really handy. Another just really quick example. I know we're a little over halfway through. Stop showing me. All right, so here I rendered this out onto a gradient background, and if I just put it on a white background, you can see here the shadows are really light because they're blended with white. Here they were blended with black, so they're really dark. So if I put this onto anything other than that background that's a gradient, I'm going to get some really weird results. So again, just be mindful of your background color. A lot of times what I'll do is I'll set that to dark gray, and then that's going to look good. If I use a multiply back in my image over here, and I can set that on whatever background color I want. Okay, so I'll cruise through that because I think that's good enough for now. Hopefully I've shown a little bit of how the Clown Pass is also really helpful for making selections, a bunch of cool stuff you can do there. Let's say we wanted to fine tune some settings. So let's say on our turntable, we wanted some element in this to pop a little bit more. We can do the same thing that we did before. Usually what I'll do is I'll grab that clown layer, put it all the way on top, just so I know it's there. I can make a quick selection of just say this top part right here. Go back to this turntable layer, and I will create a layer mask based off of that selection. And now I can go in and I can change, for example, the levels or the curves on it. So adjustments, let's go to our curves. Oh, I selected the actual mask itself. So Control M is a shortcut for curves. But now you can see I can make some really specific adjustments, either to a render layer or a selection we've created using our clown pass, right? But yeah, so if you haven't messed with layer masks, like I said, I'm not like a super Photoshop pro, so there are tons and tons of resources there. But I wanted to show you how you can get render masks, or excuse me, layer masks using those functions. All right, let's keep on cruising through because there's still some other content that I want to get into. So those are kind of the output that you get, render layers and your clown pass, that you can get those with Pro. We can also do depth of field and fog using the depth pass. We'll come back to that. Let's look at some other options first. Mostly just for the sake of time. I want to make sure we get to shadow pass and ambient occlusion pass because these are really, really cool. So what they are is an image that we can use to essentially isolate all of the shadows in our scene. So why would we want to do that? Well, sometimes dependent on our lighting, let's say you've got a product shot and you've got a white product on a white background, and you've got nice studio lights and white LEDs. Well, it's hard to make those darks dark if you have a setup like that. So what we can do is we can isolate everything to an image that just contains shadows. Easiest way to do that is I'll work with scene sets. So scene sets are another pro feature. You don't necessarily have to do this with scene sets, but this allows me to isolate everything that I'm going to do to a scene set because I'm going to do some destructive stuff. So I'll go ahead and add a scene set, and I'll call this one shadow pass because that isolates all of our material changes to this scene set. So what is our output for a shadow pass? Well, I'll show you. It's going to look like this, right? What we're going to do is we're going to assign a white diffuse material to our whole model and then render that out, because we can then take that and layer it in Photoshop, set it to multiply, and we have tons and tons of control over our shadows. So the way I actually set that up is I've created a shadow pass scene set. I'll go to the miscellaneous folder and I'll just get something like this matte white. And instead of dragging it over to a part or a couple of parts and linking and unlinking, I'm just going to drag it directly over to the master assembly part here. This is what I would call a destructive edit. I'm losing all the materials, but that's why I isolated it to that scene set. If I go back to default, my materials are still alive and well. If I go to shadow pass, now in this scene, I only have a white material with a white diffuse material. So I'll re-enable that ground plane. And what I could do is I can just put this onto a white background instead of blue. Like this. Not sure why my coordinate legend is up, but I'll hide that. So now I've got, I have this this kind of white product. Oop, and I'll copy and paste the white diffuse material. Shift left click is copy, shift right click is paste link material. So now I just have this kind of white diffuse scene. So I would render this out. The only change that I would make with rendering this, and it's the only time I ever touch this slider here, is I'll change the gamma to 1, because that'll make everything a little bit darker. So when we're working with this, right, I can keep the settings decently low, set my shadow quality, I'll keep that a little bit higher. Right, but now if I render this out, and I already did, that gives us shadows with gamma of 2. So now you can see this is just a white product with just simple shadows. Now if I select all, copy this, and then bring it back to my, my full image here, I can paste in place. So edit, paste in place. And then now if I set this to multiply, right, you can see here that that's darkening anything that was a shadow. I don't always do this. This is not part of my like daily routine, but it is a great way of just having a layer that essentially represents darkness or shadows in your scene, and we can throw that on top to kind of boost it. But yeah, I'll get rid of this white background because I did like the dark background there. And you'll notice that if I have this layer of shadows, my shadow pass, and I'll call it that. This file's getting complicated. As well as my ground plane here, right, I'm adding another layer of shadows to it, and then my kind of final composite image. So it just depends on how complex you want to get. Let's throw on our glowing lights as well. But yeah, so now in my file, without actually having to do any photoshopping, and what I mean by that is like brushing and erasing and using selection tools and hitting Control Z a bunch of times, I've created an image that has a lot more depth and kind of richness to it. So yeah, a shadow pass is used to boost those shadows. Related, similar to but not the same, is ambient occlusion. What's ambient occlusion? So an ambient occlusion pass looks really similar, but let's talk about the difference here. The shadow pass will actually use the existing lighting in the scene to calculate shadows. So as you can see here on this little vertical part that's coming up, I see shadows, but they're actually going out in a few different directions, and that's dependent on my scene lighting. Whereas here, this same part has really clean, consistent shadowing. Well, the shadowing there isn't based off of lighting, it's based off of geometric relationships, and we'll run into, how that's actually used. But ambient occlusion isn't necessarily an accurate way of representing the lighting in your scene. It's more like what the lighting would look like on a cloudy day if there was no direct light. We get really nice, even shadows. They're not necessarily true to life. So small but important distinction. So in order to create an ambient occlusion pass, we'll go back into KeyShot, and again we'll use my old favorite of scene set, because then we can create an ambient occlusion pass that's isolated to the scene set. So I'll right click on scene set, hit add scene set, and let's call this AO, short for ambient occlusion. Right. So in this case, what I'll do is I'll go over to my lighting tab, and I'm going to disable self shadows because we're not going to use the actual shadows here. What I will do is go to my miscellaneous folder in the material library, and there is a material called occlusion. So if I grab occlusion and drag it over onto my model, here you can see now everything is just a little bit darker. And let's toggle back over to that free camera. If I right click and hit look at and zoom in on my model, you'll see it's going to look a little bit different. So what occlusion does is it finds neighboring geometry, and this little portion in here is going to be a great example. My material is just diffuse, and you'll notice that the occlusion is coming from the diffuse texture. So it's an occlusion texture. What it does is essentially sends out a bunch of little feelers. Our whole piece of geometry, imagine it had fuzzy little hairs all over the place. I know, super weird image. But these little hairs are like feelers. They see if there's anything next to that piece of geometry. So for example, here on these edges, if there's a feeler out there, it doesn't see anything. It reports back that this piece of geometry right here on the surface is unoccluded, which means in this case, it's white. If it's occluded, like these little parts in here, I get these little feelers and they're interacting and they report back, hey, there's something here, so they're occluded. That's black. This is just driving color. I could set these colors to whatever I want. Unoccluded could be red, occluded could be purple, right? There's a bunch of different ways you can take this. The most simple way to use it is to essentially replicate shadows, again, like shadows on a totally sunless, cloudy day, right? So it's called ambient occlusion based off of the ambient light. So this is another use case where I'd keep the gamma at 1. Oh, also this radius slider here, that'll determine the length of those little feeler hairs. This is also unit aware. So this model, as it was imported, was modeled in millimeters. So if I go back to my material and I type in a radius of 10, that's what it would look like if those feelers are kind of sensing 10 millimeters out. If 1, it's 1 millimeter, and it's dependent on inches or meters or whatever you actually model in. But point being, if I go back to camera 1 and I do that same technique where I render this on a white background, and as you can see here, I don't have shadows on. If I turn them on, it's going to look really, really different. So that's tons and tons of shadow information. I guess I could do both if I really wanted to get a bunch of really dark shadows. But if I rendered this out, which I did, that gives me an image that is occlusion. So I did a couple different variations of that that radius. So here's with the default of 1, which is really small. I did one of 5 and all the way up to 10. So 10 gave me a little bit more definition, and I was happy with that. So again, isolating those shadows, same thing as before. I could hit Control A, select all, copy it, go back to my layer here. If I can find the right image, there we go. And I'll paste in place. Shortcut is Control Shift V. And then if I set that to multiply, then I have another layer of shadows. This is totally overkill, just FYI. I wouldn't do ambient occlusion and a shadow pass generally. I'll do one or the other. Normally, I prefer shadow passes because they are based off of the actual lighting instead of just geometric relationships. But yeah, so that's how we can generate the shadow pass and the ambient occlusion pass, and then bring those in a KeyShot and apply them as a separate layer. Let's talk about the depth pass, because that's an extra file that we got out of KeyShot when we rendered this and enabled our depth pass right there. So when I open this file in KeyShot, it's an EXR file, and in this case we don't have any transparency, so it really doesn't, unless your workflow is one where this is going to be required. I just hit OK, and then I bring in this file. So what is a depth pass? How does it work? The output is here in this image in the bottom right. It's a flat image that uses grayscale values to define distance from our camera. For example, if you're using depth of field in KeyShot, you can enable depth of field, set your f-stop, and then click to determine your focus distance, how far away our camera is focused. In Photoshop, we don't have that 3D depth information on a 2D image. So what this does is it allows you to actually have that information. You'll notice here that this image, anything that's white is farther away, anything that's black is actually closer to us. So how do we get this nice usable image out of our KeyShot EXR output? So EXR file is a 32-bit file, and in order to get something usable, these are kind of the 3 steps that you need to take. We need to adjust the HDR toning, we'll flatten it, and then we'll use the equalize histogram function. So there's probably a bunch of different ways to do this. This is definitely the easiest that I found, because when we look at it, there is nothing usable. So what I'll do is I'll go up to image, go to my adjustments, let's change the exposure. Oh, sorry, this is the manual way to do it. Sorry, I was talking instead of thinking and talking. All right, so image, adjustments, and HDR toning, right? And you can see it'll flatten. In this case, I don't really care. So once we do that, we have the option to just select equalize histogram, because what that does is it gives us the output of white pixels being far away, dark pixels being closer. So what can we do with this? Well, 2 main things that we can do with this. We can generate depth of field within Photoshop. That's not going to be as good as it is in KeyShot, and I'll show you kind of a side-by-side example. And we can also use it to do create things like fog, because now we have black and white pixels. We can use those as a layer mask. There's tons of stuff you can do with this. A tutorial I saw on pixelsquid.com was one of like, how do you make a submarine look like it's really underneath the water? And they use a depth map in order to do that. So in this case, I have equalized that histogram, so I'll hit Control A and then Control C, so copy and paste this and try to find my big giant document with all the layers in here. So I'm going to go ahead and go to my Channels tab, and then I'm going to make a new channel. And I'm just going to hit Control Shift V, paste in place, and now I have that depth map loaded into my channels. Okay, so if I hit RGB, we can actually see something. So let's emulate depth of field in Photoshop instead of doing it in KeyShot. The benefit here is that it's faster than rendering it in KeyShot. It is not going to be as accurate, but it will give you some pretty good results. Let me make sure KeyShot. Yep, it's paused. That's good. So I'll go back to my layers, and now I want to apply depth of field to this image. Well, it has to be done to a single layer, and as you can see, I'm working with a bunch of layers here. What I would normally do is merge everything and then duplicate that layer and then undo. A really easy way of doing it is hopefully this will work for me. But if you let me, I am running in virtualization, so it's not working out for me. But what I will do is it's a really complex shortcut, but if you hit Control, Alt, Shift, and E, that will stamp visible. Oh, there we go. It did it twice because I was over eager. What stamp visible does is instead of merging everything into one file, it just merges it into a duplicate file. So here I have everything that I did before, but now it's merged into a single layer. It's not like you lose your actual layers. I think if under a layer you hold down Alt while you either click on flatten image or merge visible, it's going to do that stamp visible, which is like a non-destructive way of flattening everything but keeping your layers below it. So I'll call this composite 1, and we'll just isolate that layer. So now what we'll do is we'll go into our filters, and then in order to do depth of field, we can go to our blur and then lens blur. So if I select lens blur, you'll see that it brings up my image, and it's going to apply depth of field, but right now we don't actually have any information for the depth. So what we have to do is, and it's really simple, and let me scale this down a little bit so we can see it in our window here, but we're going to set a depth map, and that's our alpha 1. That's our depth pass that we added. So if I click on that, this is going to take a second. All right, so we're previewing. But now if I click in my scene, and let me increase this radius, we should be able to replicate depth of field like we would in KeyShot in Photoshop. And it's pretty subtle, but you can see that working. Let me try increasing the radius. So let's try a big radius. And it takes a second to generate that preview. But if I click in this front corner here, what that depth map does is it's taken in a calculation here to determine what's in focus and what's out. So this is in focus, that's out of focus. If I click on this back corner, it's going to think a little bit. That's in focus, and now this is out of focus. Same thing with this little tune arm right here. So this is how you can apply depth of field in Photoshop. It's kind of accurate, it's okay. The real benefit there is that it's going to be significantly faster than rendering it out a bunch of times if you don't have a bunch of cores at your disposal. But yeah, so now that's in focus, and you can see everything else is slightly out of focus. Where the depth pass tends to get a little bit rough is when you have areas of high contrast, like if you have something that's really dark gray and a really light gray side by side, then you start to run into some problems. But otherwise, this is a really effective way of creating depth of field in Photoshop without having to wait for it to render in KeyShot. So I'll just make that application. So it's going to apply it, and then we'll see what it looks like side by side with our other one that doesn't have depth of field applied to it. Yep, still going. Maybe I should have rendered a smaller image. 8K is taking a while for it to apply that filter to. All right, so there we go. So here's, whoop, let's turn everything back on. Okay, so here's everything with no depth of field. There it is with our Photoshop depth of field applied. and some extra shadows because I forgot what other layers were on. Actually, I think this will just do it. There we go. No depth of field, no depth of field. We can use that same technique, and this is not a particularly beautiful example, but I'll show you guys anyway. I think I have it on my desktop. I get the question every once in a while, how do you represent fog? So here are a bunch of trees that were rendered, modeled in SketchUp and then rendered in KeyShot. So this was rendered out, and then we rendered out the depth pass for those trees. And so the depth pass looked something like this. And so kind of the final image, the output was this, where we actually added in fog using that depth pass. The technique there was pretty simple. So here's what that kind of flat image looked like. And then here's our depth pass. And then we just added a gradient and then used the actual depth pass as a layer mask in order to control visibility, right? And I'm holding Alt when I click on that layer mask to define the visibility. Anything that's white is visible, anything that's black is invisible. So here you can see that we're just masking the visibility of that gradient just using that layer mask, which actually contains depth information. So really neat. And if I go in and I do a quick tweak on, let's say the levels here in my depth pass, you can see how I can control where the cutoff is between close and far and things like that. So we're not actually rendering the fog in KeyShot, but we can use the tools like a depth pass in order to control that as a post process in Photoshop. The last thing I want to show you that's kind of a neat trick, and I just want to make sure that that it's there because it's a request I get every once in a while, is actually for rendering out actually two layer masks and ground shadows. So what if you want your object with actually, you don't want to make your object visible. You just want the ground shadows of that object. So if I just go back into KeyShot, this is another thing we can isolate to a scene set, which I'll do right here. So we'll do a scene set. We'll add a scene set, which is ground shadow. Right. And in this case, I will just, I'll turn off my, actually, what we'll do, I have this ground plane added, and I'm going to unlink it. And I just want that to be the default kind of ground material. So it's going to catch shadows. There we go. This material is my occlusion material, which we're going to change. So all I did with the ground was make that back into kind of a default ground shadow. Well, for our object, if I want to make that invisible but still cast a shadow, I can go into the lights folder, and if I go into the emissive folder, I can just get something, one of these emissives. It doesn't really matter what it is, but I'll apply emissive cool. You'll notice that when I apply it, it's applying it to my whole piece of geometry. That's because all those materials are linked. Or you can do what we did earlier, where you applied it to the top part of the assembly. Now I can double click on that material, which is the emissive or the light emitting material. And here I'll just uncheck the little checkbox that says visible to camera. And now our object is invisible, but actually casting a shadow, and it's on a white background. So we have dark shadows, white background. You'll also notice that I'm getting this weird kind of triangle stuff on the ground. That's actually because since I have a ground plane, my model is actually intersecting with that ground plane. So since all I really care about in this scene is the ground shadow, what I could do is go to my position tab, use the move tool, and just if I slightly offset that just a tiny little bit, even if it's just 0.2 millimeters, right, that's going to give me a nice clean ground shadow. So that if I were to isolate my whole object, going back to this example here, if I then had just that object isolated, I could have another layer for just the ground shadow, and then I can set this ground shadow to multiply and set it behind anything I want, or if I just wanted to move that part up or the ground shadow down. But that's another way to kind of isolate some piece of geometry that you want. But yeah, so that's another Every once in a while, it's helpful for boosting the ground shadows. That's another thing to do. The very last thing, I know we're going over time, the very last thing I wanted to show, because I think it is really helpful, is actually creating a mask for some piece of geometry. So in this case, and it's not a very complicated one, but I do want to at least show it. I'll just make a new scene set here, and we'll call it mask. And I'll set just a matte white material to it. The reason I'm doing this is because I want to create a mask. Let's say there's some piece of geometry in my scene that I didn't assign as a render layer, or I have some other type of technique like depth of field turned on, or motion blur, where making a selection is going to be really, really difficult. A quick rendered version of that is here's this image where I actually rendered it in KeyShot with depth of field turned on. So it's going to be smoother and cleaner than it is when we do it in KeyShot. But imagine trying to select those little dots. The ones right here, not as big of a deal. The ones, let's say back here, those are going to be a real challenge to select with the magic wand. You can see the clown pass. That's still going to be a real challenge there. Josh, this is actually kind of similar to what you're talking about with anti-aliasing and making selections, plus these two being similar. That's going to be a real pain to select other than manually. So instead, what we can do, if I go back into KeyShot, I'll isolate the piece of geometry I want to use as my mask, which in this case is these little dots. And then I'm going to unlink that material. Because I want this to be a separate material than everything else in my scene. Now, if I go in and I edit that material, I can change the material type, and I'm going to change it from diffuse to flat. Flat is just color. I'll show you what it looks like in red. Diffuse will catch shadows, but flat is no shadows, no highlights, nothing but color. So if I set this to white, that's bright white, and there's no shadows on that. That means now if I double click on any other piece of geometry, since I unlinked that piece of geometry, everything else is now, for example, red, or set it to black. And I can also set this material to flat just to make sure. And if I set up my previous, oh no, I'm still at my camera angle that I want. So camera 1, if I were to then put this on a black background instead of a white background, right, and I can even render this in performance mode. If I now render this out, then I have a perfect layer mask, and I could put on, or I can enable depth of field or motion blur or whatever I want, and then render it out, and it's going to be a good selection. I think I did render out a quick example of that. Maybe was this it? No, that's not it. This is it. There we go. So that's what it looks like when it's rendered out. So that was that same close-up view, and then now I have the mask. So if I go in and I want to select just those little dots right here, then I can use the mask that I created, and then paste that in place. And so now I have a mask that I can use in the scene where I have a much more controlled way of creating those selections. But yeah, so a layer mask pass. Again, it's using the flat material, flat white on flat black. This is also a technique you can use to make your own clown passes if you unlink all these and make them a custom color.
For more helpful tips, subscribe to our channel at youtube.com/KeyShot3D. Go to KeyShot.com/learning for more videos, tutorials, and quick tips.